Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into the fascinating world of haiku? We're going to explore its history, structure, and maybe even uncover some surprising facts along the way.
It's amazing how much depth can be packed into these short poems.
Right, like they seem simple at first glance, but there's a lot more to them than meets the eye. So before we get too deep, let's start with the basics. What exactly is a haiku? Where did this form come from?
Well, it's not some ancient art form. Haiku actually evolved from earlier types of Japanese poetry, things like renga, which were these collaborative poems where poets would take turns adding linked verses.
Oh, I see. So like a poetic relay race.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the haiku, which back then was called a hoku, was like the opening stanza of these rengas. So it kind of set the tone for the whole poetic journey that was to follow.
Wow, that's a cool way to think about it. So how did haiku break free from renga and become a thing on its own?
That's a good question. You have to jump ahead to the 17th century when poets like Matsuo Basho, maybe you've heard of him.
Oh, Basho, yeah, his name seems to be everywhere when you start reading about haiku.
Yeah, he's considered a master of haiku. And he's largely credited with making haiku what it is today. Though, fun fact, the term haiku wasn't around until much later, the late 19th century, when another poet, Masao Kashiki, came up with it.
So Basho was basically writing haiku before it was even called haiku. That's wild. Okay, so what about the key elements, the things that really make a haiku a haiku?
A lot of people think it's all about counting syllables, and while structure is definitely important, there's more to it than that.
Oh, so all those syllable counting apps I've seen might be misleading.
Yeah, potentially. See, in traditional Japanese, a haiku has 17 on, which are like sound units similar to syllables, and they're arranged in a 5-7-5 pattern. But even in Japanese, poets sometimes bend this rule, and then when you translate that into English, it gets, well, even more interesting, because English syllables don't line up perfectly with Japanese on. So even though many English haiku try to follow the 5-7-5, it's really more about capturing the essence of the form.
So syllable count is more like a guideline than a hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
Got it. What else makes up the anatomy of a haiku?
Two key elements are kigo and kyoreji. Kigo is a seasonal reference. It's like subtly weaving the time of year into the poem, almost like a hidden code for the reader to figure out.
Oh, I love that, like a little clue within the poem. What about kyoreji? What's that all about?
Kyoreji is what we call a cutting word. It's placed within the haiku to create a pause, a kind of break in the flow, prompting a moment of reflection, like a mental comma. It makes you savor the juxtaposition of the images or ideas in the poem.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but also about the silences between them. That's so poetic.
It is, and that's one of the things that makes translating haiku into English really difficult. There's no direct equivalent for kyoreji. Sometimes translators will use punctuation, like a dash or an ellipsis, to try and get that same effect, that same feeling.
Makes sense. So while the syllable structure provides the basic form, it's these other elements, the kigo and the kyoreji, that really give a haiku depth. It's
like appreciating a sculpture not just for its outward form, but also for the way light and shadow play across its surface.
Yes. That's perfect. So we've got the history and the structure down. Now for the fun part, examples.
Right.
I'd love to hear a classic haiku, maybe one by Basho, to see how all of these elements work together.
Of course. Basho's was amazing at capturing those fleeting moments in nature. One of his most famous haiku goes like this. In Japanese, it's, "At old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond splash. Silence again."
Wow, even just hearing that, I feel like I was transported to that pond for a second. It's incredible how much Bosch conveys in just 3 lines. That moment of tranquility, then sudden energy, and then back to stillness again.
It really is. And notice in the English translation, that dash after pond, it's trying to create a pause there, a kind of anticipation before the frog jumps in. It's a subtle way to get that kyoreji effect.
I see, that's brilliant. And
Yeah.
the splash at the end, it's so unexpected, yet it fits so perfectly.
Exactly. It's that element of surprise, that shift in perspective that makes haiku so captivating. And also how Basho uses such concrete imagery. The old pond, the frog, the splash, it creates such a vivid sensory experience.
Yeah, you really feel like you're right there by the pond witnessing it all.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got our classic haiku. What about haiku today? Has it stayed the same or has it changed and evolved?
Haiku is, it's a living, breathing art form, always changing, always evolving. And while traditional haiku very often focus on nature, modern haiku explore a much wider range of themes, city life, technology, personal experiences, you name it.
Yeah, I can see how a form that's all about capturing those fleeting moments could be applied to pretty much anything.
Exactly. And another interesting thing is that even though haiku originated in Japan, it's become like this global phenomenon. There are haiku communities all over the world, each one bringing its own unique flavor to the form.
So haiku is like this bridge connecting different cultures, bringing them together through this shared love for these simple, evocative poems.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Speaking of global appeal, did you know that a former European Council president is actually a big haiku enthusiast?
Wait, seriously? A politician writing haiku. Now, that's something you don't hear every day.
It's true. His name is Herman Van Rompuy, and he's actually been nicknamed Haiku Herman. He even published a book of his haiku back in 2010.
Haiku diplomacy. That's amazing. Okay, so haiku's gone global. It's evolving with the times. What else makes haiku so special, so unique?
Well, one of the things that draws people to haiku is that it's very accessible. Unlike some other forms of poetry that can feel intimidating, haiku is very short and to the point. Anyone can give it a try.
I think that's one of the things that I find so appealing about it. It doesn't feel like there are all these rules you have to master before you can even start writing.
Exactly. And because of that brevity, haiku is a really great way to introduce kids to poetry. They can easily grasp the concept of syllables and imagery without feeling overwhelmed. Plus, it encourages them to pay attention to those small details in the world around them, which is always a good thing.
That's a great point. It's like haiku teaches you to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. Speaking of paying attention, I read somewhere that writing haiku can actually enhance nature walks. Imagine composing a haiku on the spot, inspired by the things you see and hear around you.
What a great idea. It's like a mindfulness exercise,
Ah,
Slowing down, observing, and really connecting with nature.
exactly. And then you have this haiku as a little souvenir, a reminder of that experience. It makes it so much more vivid. You're not just passively walking by, you're really engaging with your surroundings and transforming them into art.
And speaking of transforming haiku into something tangible, did you know about kuhi?
Kuhi, that's a new one for me. What is that?
Kuhi are what they call poem monuments. They're basically haiku carved into natural stone, and you often find them in scenic places, blending the poetry right into the landscape.
Wow, poem monuments. That's beautiful. It's like making haiku a permanent part of the natural world it often depicts.
It really speaks to how deeply haiku is intertwined with this Japanese appreciation for nature, this awareness of the beauty and also the fleeting nature of the world around us. All this talk of haiku and nature reminds me of a couple of terms we haven't really touched on yet, wabi-sabi and sabi.
Yeah, I saw those mentioned in a few articles, but wasn't quite sure what they meant. Are they related to haiku?
They are. They're both Japanese aesthetic concepts that kind of tie into the whole haiku philosophy. Wabi-sabi is all about finding beauty in imperfection, in things that are impermanent, incomplete. And sabi, that's more specifically about beauty that comes with age, with wear and tear. Think about the patina on an old bronze statue or moss growing on a weathered stone, that kind of thing.
I'm starting to see the connection to haiku now. Those concepts definitely resonate with this idea of capturing fleeting moments, finding beauty in the natural world. That, like, haiku teaches us to appreciate not just the perfect, the pristine, but also the flawed and the ephemeral.
Exactly. And it's a pretty powerful message, especially in a world that, constantly bombards us with these images of perfection. Haiku invites us to slow down, appreciate those simple things, and find beauty in those imperfections that make life so unique and special.
So haiku's not just a type of poetry. It's also a whole philosophy, a way of seeing the world. That's fascinating. Anything else we should know about all the different sides of haiku?
You might be surprised to learn that there's actually a whole form of haiku dedicated to humor. It's called senryu.
Wait, hold on. Humorous haiku. I always thought haiku was all about quiet contemplation, nature, imagery, that kind of thing.
Those are definitely common themes, but haiku, like any art form, can be adapted,
Yeah.
Senryu uses that same 5-7-5 structure, but it focuses on human nature, social situations, those funny everyday things that make us laugh.
So that's like haiku's witty cousin. Same form, different punchline. I like that.
Yeah.
Any other surprising haiku facts that came up in your research?
One thing that struck me was how haiku can be used as a tool for personal reflection, even for processing those really difficult emotions.
That's really interesting. How does that work? I wouldn't think something so short could be used for something so deep.
Well, since haiku focuses on capturing a very specific moment, it can help us take the
Haiku animation. Now, that's something I haven't heard of before.
Yeah.
I could definitely see how haiku, with its strong imagery and brevity, would lend itself well to animation.
Absolutely. It's a great reminder that haiku can inspire creativity across all these different art forms. It goes beyond its traditional boundaries and finds new ways to express itself. All of this just goes to show that haiku is so much more than, just a three-line poem.
It really is. We've talked about its history, its structure, its global reach, its philosophical connections, and all of its creative possibilities.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much depth can be packed into such a concise form. And I think that's ultimately what makes it so captivating. It's like haiku gives us this invitation to slow down, to pay attention, and to find beauty in those simple, often overlooked things.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, what is it about haiku that draws people in? Why has this form, endured for centuries and resonated with so many across different cultures? That's a really good question. Maybe it's that simplicity that makes it so appealing. Like in this world that's so often, overwhelming and chaotic, haiku offers this little pocket of quiet reflection, a chance to just pause and appreciate those small details we often miss.
Right, like a breath of fresh air, a little reminder to slow down and savor the present moment.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe it's that very focus on the present moment that gives haiku this enduring power. It's capturing that fleeting experience. And in doing so, it reminds us of the beauty, but also the impermanence of life itself.
Thinking back on everything we've discussed about haiku, it's amazing how much depth and meaning you can fit into just a few words.
It's true. It may seem simple on the surface, but there's like a whole universe of emotion and imagery and philosophy hidden within those three short lines.
Like a little treasure chest just waiting to be opened and explored. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into haiku, what's one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
That's a good one. I guess the most important thing to remember about haiku is that it's not really about rules or about perfection, It's about capturing a moment, expressing yourself honestly, and tapping into that spark of creativity that we all have inside us.
Beautifully said. So if you're feeling inspired to give haiku a try, don't be afraid to play around with it. Break those rules. Find your own voice. Who knows? You might just discover a hidden talent for capturing those fleeting moments of beauty, those insights that make life so extraordinary.
And if you do write a haiku, share it. Don't keep it to yourself. You never know who might be touched by your words or inspired to start their own haiku journey.
That's a great note to end on. So to everyone listening, happy writing.